Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan. On December 11th, both Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and Congress responded by recognizing the state of war with those nations. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, military and political leaders began suspecting that Japan was going to prepare for a more full-scale attack on the United States. Many Americans feared that the Japanese military forces were unstoppable. The public stood by Japanese Americans living on the West Coast at first. In fact, the Los Angeles Times editorial on December 8, 1941, said that Japanese were, quote, good Americans born and educated as such. The earlier appeals for peace soon disappeared as fear about the risks for attacks grew among the nervous public. Though the administration dismissed all rumors of Japanese Americans spying, pressure mounted upon the administration as the tide of public opinion turned against the Japanese Americans. Civilian and military officials had serious concerns about the loyalty of the Japanese after the Niha incident, which immediately followed the attack of Pearl Harbor, when a civilian Japanese national and two Hawaiian-born Japanese on the island of Niha violently freed a downed and captured Japanese naval airman, attacking their fellow Niha Islanders in the process. The Roosevelt administration asked military officials to recommend a course of action. General John D. Witt, the West Coast Army commander, submitted his recommendation to the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. At first, General D. Witt put in place a nighttime curfew on all persons of Japanese ancestry who lived on the West Coast. The curfew also applied to enemy aliens who held German or Italian citizenship. A few weeks later, under military orders, all Japanese Americans on the West Coast were given 1 week to dispose of all their personal belongings, except for what they could pack into one suitcase and report to assembly centers. More than 110,000 American citizens and legal residents whom were never charged with crimes or given a hearing to challenge their detentions were imprisoned for an indefinite period. Only a few challenged their detention. One of those was Fred Korematsu.
Following the tragic events of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an Executive Order No. 9066, which forced a military relocation of American citizens of Japanese heritage to internment camps based on the fear that their loyalty would be to Japan. This conflict led Mr. Fred Korematsu's opposition to this relocation. His complaint would be heard by Supreme Court, who would uphold the relocation.
The Japanese left Japan to find peace and prosperity. They were living on unstable homeland and seized the opportunity to come to the United States for jobs. They first came to the Pacific Northwest in the 1880s when federal legislation excluded further Chinese immigrants. This created demands for new immigrant labor. Railroads in particular recruited Issei's, or the first-generation immigrants from Hawaii and Japan. Japanese workers helped construct the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Oregon Short Line, and other railroads in the Columbia River Basin. In the early 1900s, the Japanese made up about 40% of Oregon's total railroad labor force. The Japanese also worked at fish canneries, farms, and sawmills. In addition, Executive Order 9066 allowed for the arrest of Germans and Italians whom the FBI considered a security risk and labeled them as enemy aliens. The American government extended the search to Latin America, where the suspected enemies were brought to a secret government internment camp located in Crystal City, Texas, which was only 30 miles away from the Mexican border. Roosevelt feared threats to the American citizens in Latin America. In the internment camps, Japanese Americans followed strict rules and curfews. The internment camps did offer education programs and some employment opportunities, and the Japanese Americans also organized to create Japanese language classes and other programs to maintain their culture. After the war, however, Japanese Americans were met with hostility as they attempted to get back to their former lives. Many found that their properties had been seized for non-payment of taxes. Other problems included people's negative views based on racism.
Fred Korematsu was a 23-year-old who did not think it was right to take away Japanese Americans because they were legal. He did not go to the internment camps when he was told to go. Fred tried to keep away. He even got a little plastic surgery to try to make his eyes look less like a Japanese. Then, one day, a little after the start of moving Japanese Americans to internment camps, Fred was out walking with his girlfriend when the military saw him and took him to jail for defying government orders. Fred Korematsu took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court ruled against him, saying it was military necessity that he should have gone. No one should ever be locked away simply because they share the same race, ethnicity, or religion as a spy or terrorist. Fred Korematsu.
One of the internment camps was called Manizar War Relocation Center in California. It opened on March 21, 1942, and closed on November 21, 1945. Manizar had 10,046 people. Another internment camp was in True Lake, California. There was 18,789 people. There was also Topaz in central Utah. It opened on September 11, 1942, and closed October 31, 1945, and it had 8,130 people. Theodore Seuss Geisel, later known as Dr. Seuss, was the chief cartoonist for the New York newspaper PM from 1940 to 1948. Geisel was vocally anti-Japanese during the war. He didn't see a problem with rounding this population of U.S. citizens and putting them in camps. In 1953, Geisel visited Japan, where he met and talked with people and witnessed the horrific aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima. He soon started to rethink his anti-Japanese views. He issued an apology form of a children's book, Horton Hears a Who. One important statement made in this book is, "A person is a person, no matter how small." He dedicated this book to his great friend Mitsugi Nakamura of Kyoto, Japan.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan offered a formal apology and $20,000 payment to those compromised by Executive Order No. 9066.
We gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
The lesson that can be learned from the compromise of Japanese American people during World War II is that it is wrong to view entire populations, Japanese or Muslim or Hispanics or even Americans, to the characteristics of a few. This is at the heart of what it means not to be prejudiced.